The sand of the moon designated X-33 did not drift like the dunes of our ancestral homeworld. It was fine, sharp, and entirely composed of silicate glass that ground against the seals of our combat armor with a sound like a dying gasp. We had the asset. It was encrypted inside a heavy carbon case strapped to my primary harness. A localized hyperspatial array stolen from the human research station 3 leagues behind us. The raid had been elegant. Perfect. My infiltration unit had moved through their perimeter like ghosts through smoke. My species, the Krell, evolved in the deep canopy jungles of a world where survival is measured in milliseconds. We are apex ambushers. Our musculature is composed of hyperdense white fibers capable of unleashing explosive kinetic velocity. We do not stalk. We strike, we kill, and we vanish. When the human alarms finally blared, we were already a mile away, sprinting across the glass sand at 40 miles per hour. By the time their local security forces organized a search vector, we had crossed the rocky ridge line and dissolved into the shifting white desert. No vehicle could track our path through the thermal distortions of this moon's twin suns. No orbital sensor could pierce the iron-heavy magnetosphere. We were safe. We were untouchable. 3 hours into our escape, the first sun dipped beneath the horizon, plunging the temperature from a blistering scorch to a bitter, freezing dark. My squad halted in the shadow of a basalt monolith. The metabolic toll of our explosive flight was heavy. Our biology requires a steep price for our speed. Our systems demand a state of torpor every few hours to purge the toxic buildup of lactic acid from our muscles and cool our hyperextended nervous systems. Without rest, our fibers seize. Without sleep, our brains misfire. I ordered a standard 2-hour defensive cycle. We activated our active camouflage, blending our scales perfectly into the jagged black stone. We deployed our automated motion sensors in a 300-meter perimeter, highly sensitive acoustic arrays that could detect the footfall of a native burrowing insect. I closed my secondary eyelids, letting the cold, heavy bliss of torpor pull me under. My squad slept as all civilized species sleep. To rest is to survive. Exactly 54 minutes later, the proximity grid didn't sound an alarm. It emitted a soft, rhythmic pulse directly into my audio receptor. Chirp, chirp, chirp. I snapped awake, my heat signature visors flaring to life. My scout, Yarrick, was already crouching near the sensor console, his mandibles twitching with irritation. Malfunction, Yarrick muttered, his voice a low, gravelly click. The acoustic sensors are registering a rhythmic vibration from the north-northeast. But the thermal sweep shows nothing. No engine signatures. No thruster heat. Nothing but the cold sand. I leaned over his shoulder, looking at the digital display. The sensor wasn't malfunctioning. The spikes were small but perfectly spaced. Every tick was separated by exactly 0.8 seconds. Thump, thump, thump. It was too steady to be a wild animal. It was too slow to be a vehicle. I shifted my visor to maximum magnification, aiming the high-lens optic toward the distant horizon where the white glass dunes met the black sky. For a long time, there was only the dancing haze of the cooling desert. Then, cutting through the moonlight, I saw them. 4 dark silhouettes. Walking. They weren't running. They weren't riding skimming bikes. They were traveling on foot, their long bipedal strides moving with a terrifying, mechanical regularity. They were still 2 miles away, but they were heading precisely down our transit vector. They were walking directly into our footprints. The humans from the outpost, Yarrick whispered, his scales shifting to an agitated, dull gray. How? We left them miles behind in the rocks. They shouldn't even know which direction we turned. The wind erased our tracks within minutes. Pack up the gear, I commanded, a strange cold knot tightening in my chest. They must have a localized tracker we failed to detect on the asset case. We move now. Another burst of speed will put them 10 miles behind us. They will lose the signal or their energy cells will deplete. We rose from our nests, our muscles stiff from the cut-short torpor, and launched ourselves back into the dark desert, sprinting until our lungs burned like fire. By the time the second sun began to bleed over the eastern edge of the moon, we had run for another 2 hours. The glass sand was a blinding, shimmering white under the dual glare. My squad was flagging. Yarrick's breathing had turned into a wet, rattling hiss, his mouth agape as he tried to pull oxygen into lungs that were never meant for sustained exertion. We stopped in a dry sandstone canyon, our active camouflage flickering as our internal suits drained their battery reserves to keep up with our erratic body heat. They cannot be behind us, Yarrick gasped, collapsing against a boulder, his tail twitching erratically. We ran at maximum velocity. No biological creature can sustain that metabolic output. their hearts would rupture. I didn't answer him. I pulled my wrist console up and brought up the asset case's diagnostics. No signal was escaping. The shielding was absolute. They weren't tracking a beacon. I looked back down our trail. The wind on X-33 was fierce, throwing up clouds of fine silica that filled our footprints within 10 minutes of our passing. There was no physical trail to follow. There was no electronic signature. Yet an uneasy sensation, a primal ancestral dread, was clawing its way up my spine. I opened our tactical network and brought up the restricted intelligence database, pulling up the document I had hoped never to look at, the Deathworlder Protocol. I bypassed the weapons analysis and clicked straight into the physiological profile for the species Homo sapiens. My eyes scanned the translated data, and what I read made my blood turn cold. Thermal regulation, highly anomalous. Humans do not possess scales or thick fur, nor do they rely on panting or behavioral cooling. They possess millions of microtubular glands embedded across their entire dermis that exude an aqueous solution, sweat. As the moisture evaporates, it cools their core temperature while they are in motion. I looked at Yarrick, whose skin was dry, hot, and cooking from the inside out because our bodies could only dump heat while resting in the shade. I scrolled further down the text. Locomotion efficiency, extreme. Humans are obligate bipeds. Their skeletal geometry acts as a series of inverted pendulums. With every step, gravity carries their momentum forward, requiring virtually zero muscular energy to maintain a steady walking pace of 3 to 4 miles per hour. While an ambush predator burns through its entire glycogen store in a 5-minute sprint, a human can walk for 24 standard hours without reaching metabolic exhaustion. My display chimed. It was the long-range thermal sensor I had left on the canyon rim. I didn't want to look at it. I forced my hand to slide the interface open. 4 heat signatures. They were closer now. They had closed the gap. While we had run in an explosive, desperate burst and then been forced to collapse in exhaustion, they had simply kept walking. They hadn't stopped to sleep. They hadn't stopped to cool down. They were moving at the exact same pace they had been moving at midnight. 3.5 miles per hour. Unbroken. Relentless. They aren't tracking a beacon, Yarrick, I whispered, my voice sounding hollow in the narrow canyon. They are tracking us. How? Yarrick snarled, his eyes wide with a manic, sleep-deprived panic. There are no tracks. They don't need tracks. They track the micro-disturbances in the sand. They track the broken glass stones. They track the minute chemical traces of the moisture our suits vent when we overheat. They are persistence hunters. From the canyon entrance, a mile away, a faint sound echoed off the stone walls. It wasn't a war cry. It wasn't the roar of an engine. It was a low, rhythmic human cadence, a marching song hummed by one of the Marines to keep the rhythm of their feet. They were singing. They were a mile behind an elite Krellian infiltration unit in the middle of a lethal desert death world, and they were casually singing. Move! I barked, grabbing Yarrick by his shoulder armor and dragging him to his feet. We don't stop. We don't hide. If we stay here, we die here. We scrambled out of the canyon, our boots slipping against the loose shale. The suns were at their zenith now, turning the sky into a searing sheet of brass. The heat was a physical blow, a hammer striking our skulls with every step. My internal suit monitors were flashing amber. My core temperature was climbing toward the threshold of cellular degradation. Behind us, the marching song stopped. It was replaced by the low, distorted crackle of a human tactical radio echoing off the canyon walls. They weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. They knew we could hear them. They wanted us to hear them. Target has broken cover, a flat, female voice reported over the distance. They're picking up the pace again. Moving north toward the extraction plateau. Copy that, lead, a male voice replied, his breathing rhythmic, deep, and steady. Let them run. The heat will do half our job for us. Just keep your stride. The casual indifference of their words was a poison in our minds. They weren't chasing us with anger. They were chasing us like a harvester tracks a yield. We forced our legs to move, but the explosive white fibers of our muscles were failing. Lactic acid had turned our limbs into lead. Yarrick stumbled, his knees buckling as we reached the base of the long, steep incline leading to the extraction plateau. He didn't get back up. He lay on his stomach, his scales dry and brittle, his chest heaving as he stared back down the trail. I can't, he whispered, a thick, dark fluid leaking from his nostrils. Zyler, leave the case. Run. No, I hissed, looking down at him. But as I turned my head, I saw them emerge from the mouth of the canyon. They were half a mile away. They looked tiny against the vast, shimmering expanse of the white desert, but their silhouettes were unmistakable. They were still walking. One of them adjusted the strap of a heavy plasma rifle with casual familiarity. Another took a brief, calculated sip from a hydration tube connected to their pack, never breaking their stride as they drank. They looked like statues that had learned to march. Yarrick pulled his sidearm, a high-frequency kinetic pistol, and aimed it down the slope with trembling hands. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely unblinking. "Stay back," he screamed into the empty desert, his voice breaking into a panicked shriek. "Stay back, you monsters." He fired. The high-velocity rounds kicked up plumes of white sand 50 yards ahead of the humans, completely missing the target. His depth perception was gone, shattered by sleep deprivation and exhaustion. The humans didn't even dive for cover. They didn't scatter. They merely tilted their heads slightly, adjusting their formation by a few meters to account for the incoming trajectory, and kept coming. Step after step. Thump, thump, thump. "They aren't stopping," Yarrick wept, dropping the pistol into the sand. "Why won't they stop?" A sharp, high-velocity crack echoed across the plateau. Yarrick's chest exploded in a flash of blue thermal energy. The human sniper hadn't stopped to aim. They had simply synchronized their trigger pull with the rhythm of their stride, eliminating the threat without ever slowing down their advance. I didn't look back again. I hauled myself up the rocky incline, my hands clawing at the sharp glass stones, leaving a trail of my own dark blood behind me. The extraction ship had to be close. The beacon was humming in my ear. If I could just reach the ridge, if I could just find a place to sleep for an hour, I could survive. But as I reached the top of the plateau, my heart stopped. The landing zone was empty. The horizon stretched out in a flat, featureless line of blinding white glass under the twin suns. There was no ship. The extraction window had passed, or the fleet had seen the incoming human signatures and pulled back to avoid an orbital lock. I collapsed onto my back, my muscles locking up in a final, agonizing spasm. The carbon case rested against my chest, a useless block of metal. I closed my primary eyes, but the darkness brought no relief. In the silence of my own mind, the only thing I could hear was the steady, unbroken cadence of the footsteps coming up the hill. If you want to hear the final transmission of Captain Zyler, and find out what happens when the Krellian Empire realizes they can never hide from the unblinking eye of Earth, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. The hunt is far from over, and humanity is tracking every single footprint you leave in the dark. Subscribe now and don't lose the trail. The footsteps stopped. I forced my secondary eyelids open, the blinding glare of the twin suns cutting into my retinas. The heat haze danced across the flat glass of the plateau, twisting the air into shimmering ribbons. Standing at the edge of the ridge, silhouetted against the brass sky, were the four humans. They weren't panting. Their chests rose and fell with a deep, measured efficiency. Their faces were slick with moisture, their skin reddened by the dual radiation of X-33, but their eyes were clear, sharp, entirely focused. The lead human, the female who had spoken on the radio, walked forward. The heavy soles of her combat boots crunched against the brittle silicate. She stopped 3 paces from where I lay paralyzed by my own locked muscles. She didn't raise her rifle to aim at my head. She simply slung it over her shoulder, letting it hang against her tactical vest. "End of the line, Captain," she said. Her voice was slightly raspy from the desert dust, but it possessed a terrifyingly calm conversational weight. I tried to draw a breath, my mandibles clicking uselessly as I struggled to find the words in their harsh language. "How?" I choked out, a thin line of gray foam bubbling at the edge of my mouth. "We ran 40 leagues, without a breath. You are primitives. You have no speed." The human looked down at me, her expression completely devoid of malice. It was worse than hatred. It was the cold, clinical look of a biologist examining a specimen that had run itself to death in a maze. "We don't need speed," she said softly, crouching down beside me. The scent of her sweat filled the air, a sharp, chemical smell of salt and iron that signaled the presence of an apex predator that didn't know how to tire. "Our ancestors didn't have claws, Captain. We didn't have venom, and we couldn't run down a gazelle in a 100-meter sprint. But we could walk. We could walk until the gazelle's heart burst from the heat. We could walk until the beast collapsed into the dirt, begging for the spear just to make the running stop." She reached out and unclipped the heavy carbon case containing the hyperspatial array from my harness. The weight lifted from my chest, but the suffocating terror remained. "You're built for the short game," she continued, standing back up and tossing the case to the Marine behind her. "You think a 5-mile lead means you've won. But to a human, 5 miles is just the first hour of a shift. We don't sleep when we're on the clock. We just keep our stride. She pulled a small silver tracking beacon from her tactical pouch and dropped it into the sand right beside my head. It began to blink with a steady, rhythmic green light. What is that? I rasped, my vision beginning to tunnel as my metabolic systems shut down from sheer exhaustion. That's for your retrieval team, the Marine said, turning her back on me and facing the endless expanse of the white desert. When they finally get the nerve to land, tell them we're keeping the array. And tell them if they want it back, we're walking back to the frontier outpost. It's a 40-mile trek. She looked back over her shoulder, a grim, unblinking stare cutting through the glare of the twin suns. Tell them to start walking. We'll be waiting. She signaled her squad. The 4 Marines fell into file, their long, balanced strides cutting through the shimmering heat haze. They didn't double time. They didn't rush. They simply fell back into that same mechanical, terrifying cadence. 3.5 miles per hour. As the darkness of metabolic coma finally dragged me under, the last thing I heard echoing across the empty, burning plateau was the slow, rhythmic thump of their boots fading into the white sand. Thump, thump, thump. The galaxy is vast, but it is not wide enough to hide your tracks. If you want to ensure you're always on the right side of the hunt, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a like on this log. The frontier is expanding, and humanity never stops walking. Subscribe now and join the pursuit. Across the deep sectors of the Krellian core, the transmission from X-33 did not arrive as a standard military update. It was a digital ghost, a raw, unedited black box log that leaked through our encrypted networks like oil through a cracked hull. High Command tried to suppress it. They flagged it, locked it behind automated security firewalls, and claimed it was a corrupted file from a broken drone. But soldiers talk. And predators know when they are no longer at the top of the food chain. I am Fleet Tactician Vor. I was tasked with analyzing the final seconds of Captain Zyler's squad. 4-3 standard rotations, I sat in the silent luxury of my climate-controlled command suite, staring at the telemetry. I watched the heat signatures of 4 humans move across a lethal desert planet with the terrifying, mathematical precision of an active clock mechanism. Our military academies teach us that warfare is an art of geometry and explosive kinetic energy. You find the enemy's flank, you unleash a blinding barrage of plasma or high-velocity slugs, and you shatter their cohesion in a single devastating moment of violence. If the strike fails, you pull back, recharge your biological reserves, and wait for the next optimal window. That is how civilized species fight. The humans do not care about our academies. They do not care about the elegant rhythm of the strike and the retreat. I checked the records from the human frontier outpost that Zyler's team had raided. According to the station's automated logs, the 4 Marines who tracked him were not a specialized tracker commando unit. They weren't elite reconnaissance shock troops. They were a standard, low-tier border patrol detachment. 2 of them were planetary colonists who had enlisted less than 2 standard cycles ago. One of them had been on a double shift when the raid occurred. By the time they set out into the glass desert on foot, she had already been awake for 14 hours. Think about that. Let the cold reality of that data settle into your mind as it settled into mine. To a Krell, an extra 14 hours of consciousness without torpor would cause catastrophic neural misfires. Our muscles would lock with toxic proteins. Our vision would blur until we couldn't distinguish a rock from an enemy combatant. But that female human Marine simply strapped an extra 3-liter bladder of salted water to her vest, checked the battery cell on her standard-issue rifle, and stepped out into a 70-degree desert without a second thought. They didn't even use their tactical HUDs to analyze our path. The forensics report showed that the lead human was using a primitive biological method her species calls bent press tracking. She was looking for the microscopic cracks we left in the glass sand when our 40-mile-per-hour sprints forced our claws to dig deep. She was looking for the slight discoloration in the dust where our suits had vented our chemical sweat. They read our panic in the dirt. They tracked our exhaustion by the width of our strides. Every time Zyler's squad ran, they thought they were creating safety. They thought that putting 10 miles of empty desert between themselves and their pursuers would break the human morale. They did not understand that to a persistence hunter, a running target is just a target that is cooking itself faster. Every explosive burst of speed from our vanguard was just a deposit of energy we could never recover, while the humans were paying a flat, predictable, and incredibly cheap metabolic fee with every rhythmic step they took. I have submitted my official recommendation to the Grand Admiralty. It is a brief, 1-page document. I did not include complex structural diagrams or tactical orbital coordinates. I simply attached the Deathworlder Protocol physiological files on human lung capacity, their specialized bipedal hip structure, and their anomalous sweat gland distribution. Beneath the data, I wrote a single sentence. If you engage a human ground force and fail to eliminate them in the first 90 seconds, abandon the sector. They are already walking toward you. The High Command has not replied to my message. They are currently preparing a massive counteroffensive to retake the hyperspatial array from the frontier outpost. They are sending heavy troop transports, armor divisions, and thousands of young, proud Krellian warriors who still believe that their speed makes them invincible. They think they are going to a battle. They don't realize they are walking into a marathon against a monster that never blinks. The white sands of X-33 are waiting, and the footsteps are already starting to echo down the line. If you want to stay ahead of the vanguard and receive the next tactical analysis from the edge of human territory, make sure to hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this archive, and leave your thoughts in the secure comms below. The galaxy is turning cold and humanity is just getting warmed up. Subscribe now and keep your pace.